The Central Operations Control Room of the Carabinieri in Naples received a call. The caller, a resident of an apartment building in the residential area of Fuorigrotta, reported a strong, unbearable odor that had been seeping from a neighboring apartment on the 4th floor for several days. He described it as sweet and nauseating, adding that the smell was getting stronger by the hour and that the occupant of the apartment, a middle-aged man, had stopped answering the phone and knocking on the door. Such calls were not uncommon for operators, but the caller's persistence and detailed description prompted the officer on duty to dispatch the nearest patrol to the address. 15 minutes later, 2 carabinieri arrived at a typical 1970s yellow brick apartment building. The air in the stairwell was stuffy, but at first glance, there was no obvious source of concern. However, upon reaching the 4th floor, the officers immediately realized that the call was justified. At the door of apartment number 17, there was a concentrated, heavy smell of decay that could not be mistaken for anything else. The officers followed protocol. They knocked loudly on the metal door, announcing their presence. There was no response. No sound came from inside, except for the faint hum of a working mechanism. Attempts to contact the resident by phone, whose number was in the database, were unsuccessful. Neighbors who came out to investigate confirmed that they had not seen the apartment's occupant for several days, possibly a week. They also noted a constant humming noise coming from behind the door, presumably from an air conditioner, which was unusual for the cool May weather. After obtaining permission from the duty prosecutor to enter the apartment, due to a possible threat to the life and health of the person inside, the Carabinieri called the fire department, Vigili del Fuoco. The firefighters arrived quickly and used hydraulic tools to break open the lock. The door gave way with a sharp click, and a wave of thick, cold air mixed with the smell of death rushed into the hallway, so strong that it made everyone recoil. The senior patrol officer was the first to enter the apartment. The room was plunged into semi-darkness. The living room windows were tightly curtained, and the only source of light was the screen of a television set, which was silently showing scenes from some daytime show. On the coffee table was a plate with leftover food and an empty pizza box. The apartment did not look ransacked or robbed. On the contrary, there were signs of recent domestic life. But the primary source of the smell was the bedroom, the door to which was ajar. It was from there that the monotonous hum of the air conditioner running at full power came. The officer, covering his nose and mouth with his sleeve, stepped inside. The room was small and tidy. A nightlight burned on the bedside table, casting dim, uneven shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood a double bed, on which a human silhouette could be discerned under a bright plaid blanket. The figure lay motionless. The officer did not touch the body. He just shone his flashlight, and even in the dim light, it was obvious that the person was dead and had been for a long time. He immediately reported the discovery of the body to headquarters. He requested that an investigative team and forensic experts be sent to the scene. The area around the house was cordoned off, and access to the floor was blocked. Soon, specialists from the Scientific Investigation Department, Reparto Investigazioni Scientifiche, arrived at the scene. Dressed in white protective suits, they began methodical work to secure evidence at the scene, which in a matter of hours had been transformed from a residential apartment into a sealed crime scene. A preliminary examination revealed that the body hidden under the blanket was that of a young woman. Signs of violent death were not apparent due to advanced post-mortem changes. Still, the position and circumstances indicated that the death was not natural. The main question that arose for investigators in the first few minutes was not only who did this, but also what happened in this apartment while the body was here. The air conditioner running at full blast, a pizza box, and the TV left on indicated that someone had been living in the apartment next to the dead body. But who? And more importantly, where were they now? The owner of the apartment, 39-year-old Gianmarco Russo, was not officially reported missing. While forensic experts worked in the apartment, turning it into a sterile laboratory, the first stage of the investigation began in the offices of the investigative department. The case was handed over to prosecutor Marco Bellini, a 45-year-old specialist in serious crimes, known for his methodical and meticulous approach. The first task was to identify the victim. Due to severe post-mortem changes, visual identification was impossible. The body was immediately transported to the Institute of Forensic Medicine at the University Clinic of Naples for an autopsy and collection of biomaterials. At the same time, investigators began searching for the owner of the apartment, Gianmarco Russo. A standard verification procedure was launched. His name was checked against all police and medical databases. He was not listed as a patient in any hospital, was not registered in morgues, and did not appear in traffic accident reports. His cell phone was turned off, and the last signal was recorded near his home more than a day ago. Initial information about Russo did not paint a picture of a violent criminal. He was a 39-year-old locksmith, owner of a small workshop, with no criminal record except for a few parking tickets. Neighbors described him as a reserved but generally quiet man who always said hello in the elevator, but never engaged in long conversations. No one could recall hearing screams or sounds of a struggle coming from his apartment. The only oddity noted by several residents was that in recent days he had seemed nervous and fussy, but no one thought much of it. Meanwhile, forensic investigators continued their work in the apartment. Fingerprints were taken from all surfaces, but most of them, as expected, belonged to Gianmarco. Female fingerprints were also found, but without a database to compare them to, they did not provide any information at this stage. An important find was a series of receipts from a food delivery service dated May 16th, 18th, and 21. This confirmed a shocking hypothesis. Someone had been in the apartment and living an everyday life while the body was decomposing in the next room. The absence of signs of forced entry indicated that the victim had either entered the apartment voluntarily or had been brought there by someone with a key. A breakthrough in the investigation came on the second day, May 26th. The central office received a request from the Vomero District Police Station. It turned out that on May 19th, the parents and a friend of 27-year-old Sophia Montalto had reported her missing. According to their statements, Sophia had stopped communicating with them on the evening of May 15th. The last thing they knew was that she was going to her ex-boyfriend, Gianmarco Russo, to pick up her remaining personal belongings. When she did not show up for work at the pharmacy the next day and did not answer her phone, her family raised the alarm. They contacted the police, but encountered an unexpected obstacle. Gianmarco Russo, whom they called first, calmly informed them. Then the carabinieri, who arrived at the scene, learned that Sophia had indeed visited him, picked up a couple of bags, and said she was leaving for a few days in Genoa with her new boyfriend. He claimed that she did not want to talk to anyone and asked them not to bother her. This version, backed up by Russo's apparent calmness, temporarily threw the investigation off track. An official search was initiated, but the case was not given priority status, as the disappearance of an adult of sound mind, who, according to a witness, had left voluntarily, was not considered criminal. Now, after the discovery of the body in Russo's apartment, these two cases, the unidentified corpse and the missing girl, were instantly linked. The description of Sophia Montalto's appearance provided by her parents matched the preliminary data from the forensic experts about the victim. Sophia's dental records were requested for final identification. A comparison of dental X-rays left no doubt. The body found in Gianmarco Russo's apartment belonged to Sophia Montalto. From that moment on, the investigation took a clear direction. Gianmarco Russo went from being the owner of the apartment and an essential witness to the main and only suspect in the murder. His name was immediately added to the National Wanted list. Photos were sent to all patrols, train stations, and airports. Investigators questioned Sophia's family and friends again, but this time the questions were different. They were asked to describe in detail the relationship between Sophia and Gianmarco, and the picture that began to emerge from these statements was far from the idyll that the suspect had tried to present to the police. One after another, witnesses spoke of Russo's pathological jealousy, his constant attempts to control Sophia's every move, and the scandals he caused over her communication with friends or even her makeup. It became known that his lie about the trip to Genoa was not just an attempt to hide the truth, but a cold, calculated move that allowed him to gain precious time. He didn't just kill her. He created an information vacuum that delayed the discovery of the crime by 9 whole days. While her family was going crazy with worry, he was living a few meters away from her body, ordering pizza and watching TV, maintaining the illusion of normality in the heart of a nightmare. Sophia Montalto, 27 years old, was a methodical and predictable person in the best sense of the word. Until a certain point, her life had followed a clear and understandable routine that she had created for herself. After graduating with honors from the Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Naples, Federico Lecca, she got a job at a pharmacy in the prestigious Chiaia district, where she quickly earned a reputation as a competent and attentive specialist. Colleagues interviewed by investigators described her as a reserved but friendly girl, always ready to help, a professional who knew hundreds of drugs and their interactions by heart. During questioning, her mother tearfully recounted that Sophia had dreamed of this profession since childhood. She liked the idea of helping people, bringing relief, and working in a field where precision and responsibility were necessary. She lived with her parents, but was actively saving money, planning to buy her own home shortly. In her world, there seemed to be no place for chaos and violence. However, behind the facade of this orderly life, a relationship had been slowly but surely destroying her from within for almost 5 years. She had known Gianmarco Russo practically all her life. He was 12 years older than her and lived in the same neighborhood where she had spent her childhood. In their youth, they hardly spoke to each other, belonging to different generations. Still, about 5 years ago, they met again by chance. At first, Gianmarco seemed to Sophia to be the embodiment of reliability. He was a mature, successful man with a job, and he appeared caring and courteous. He courted her beautifully, gave her flowers, and took her to dinner at restaurants with a view of the bay. Her friends recalled that Sophia seemed truly happy during the first 6 months. But soon the first warning signs began to appear. At first, they were almost imperceptible jabs of jealousy, questions about who had called her, why she was 15 minutes late for work, which of her male colleagues had been on shift that day. Sophia, unaccustomed to such behavior, dismissed it as his strong feelings and insecurity. But the control gradually increased, becoming more and more comprehensive and systematic. After a year of the relationship, according to her close friend, Gianmarco began to openly express dissatisfaction with her appearance. He didn't like it when she wore red lipstick. It was too provocative, he said. He would criticize dresses that he thought were too short. Gradually, Sophia almost stopped using makeup and began to choose more modest and inconspicuous clothes to avoid another argument. Then he began to control her social contacts. Meetings with her friends became a reason for interrogation. If she went to a cafe, he demanded a photo report. After she returned, he would call one of her friends under the pretext of just saying hello to make sure that Sophia was where she said she was. Eventually, tired of the constant arguments, Sophia began to see her friends less and less. He methodically isolated her from her usual circle of friends, replacing them with himself. The key phrase that several witnesses heard him say, and that he constantly repeated to her was, "You are mine, and you will always be mine." This was not a declaration of love, but a statement of ownership. Sophia's digital correspondence, partially recovered by forensic experts from her laptop, showed that Gianmarco demanded her passwords for social media and email. He regularly checked her messages and call log. Anything like a photo from an unknown man or a message from an old classmate could trigger hours of arguments and accusations of infidelity. Sophia lived in a state of constant stress. She tried to end the relationship several times, but each time she was met with a barrage of threats, pleas, and emotional blackmail. Gianmarco cried, swore he would change, said he couldn't live without her, and an hour later would send a message with a veiled threat. This cycle of violence and remorse kept her trapped. However, in the spring of 2022, Sophia had a breakthrough. She realized that she couldn't go on like this. Without telling Gianmarco or even her parents, she rented a small apartment. It was her first step toward freedom. Around the same time, at a conference for pharmacists, she met Andrea, a 42-year-old chemistry professor at the university. Their relationship began as a friendship, but soon grew into something more. Andrea, calm, intelligent, and respectful of her opinion, was the complete opposite of Gianmarco. He became for Sophia the embodiment of the everyday, healthy life she had been denied for so long. It was this new relationship that gave her the strength to finally break up with Gianmarco. In early May, she told Gianmarco that she was leaving him. According to her, which she later recounted to a friend, he took the news surprisingly calmly, saying only that he needed time to accept it. This reaction lulled her into a false sense of security. On May 15th, she decided she had to take the final step, pick up the rest of her belongings from his place to close this chapter of her life once and for all. She told Andrea that it would take no more than an hour. She believed she could do it quickly and safely, unaware that her former partner had no intention of letting her go. His calmness was not acceptance, but a mask behind which a mature and well-thought-out plan was hidden. While a warrant for Gianmarco Russo was being circulated throughout the country and his photo appeared in the evening news, prosecutor Bellini's team was working to reconstruct the events of that fateful evening of May 15th. By comparing cell phone billing data, witness statements, and preliminary autopsy results, investigators were able to reconstruct the last hours of Sophia Montalto's life with a high degree of accuracy. She arrived at Gianmarco's apartment around 8 p.m. Phone records showed that immediately before that, she exchanged several messages with Andrea, in which she wrote that everything will be quick and that she would call him as soon as she was free. This was the last message she sent herself. Apparently, the conversation with Gianmarco began calmly. There were no signs of a struggle in the apartment, indicating a sudden attack. No overturned furniture or broken objects. Criminal psychologists called into the case suggested that Russo had used his last chance to try to manipulate and persuade Sophia to return. He was met with a calm and unwavering determination that he was not prepared for. Sophia, emboldened by her new relationship and plans for the future, no longer succumbed to his tricks. It was this final, firm refusal that, according to investigators, triggered the attack. When words lost their power, he resorted to the only tool of control he had left: physical violence. The conclusion of the forensic medical examination was unequivocal. Death was caused by mechanical asphyxiation due to strangulation. Characteristic pressure marks were found on the victim's neck, and internal hemorrhages and a fracture of the hyoid bone testified to the force with which the killer acted. Numerous bruises were found on Sophia's wrists and forearms, traces of a desperate struggle. She was not a passive victim. She fought back until the very end. According to experts, death occurred between 9 and 10 p.m. on May 15th. Immediately after committing the crime, Gianmarco Russo did not flee or panic. On the contrary, his subsequent actions demonstrated chilling composure and calculation. He carried Sophia's body to the bedroom and laid her on the bed, covering her with a blanket as if she were asleep. Then he turned the air conditioner on full blast, setting it to the lowest temperature. It was a cynical and pragmatic measure aimed at slowing down the decomposition process and, accordingly, delaying the appearance of the smell of a dead body. He drew the curtains and turned on a nightlight, creating a crypt in the room where time stood still. After that, he began methodically covering up his tracks and creating a false narrative. A short message was sent from Sophia's phone to her mother, containing the vague phrase, "Mom, everything's fine. Don't worry. I'll call you later." This allowed him to gain a few precious hours. When her worried parents and the police contacted him the next day, he was already prepared with a story about Sophia's sudden departure for Genoa with a new lover. He played his part convincingly, and they believed him. And then began 9 days of surreal existence. While a nationwide search operation was underway, investigators gathered evidence of his life in the apartment next to the body of the woman he had killed. Financial records showed that he had ordered food delivery 3 times: pizza, sushi, and Chinese noodles. He continued to use the internet, his browser history showing searches for football matches and news sites. He lived his everyday life, ignoring the horrific reality he had created. For him, Sophia was not dead in the true sense of the word. She was there with him in his apartment. She could no longer leave, argue, or meet other people. He had achieved his goal. She was completely and utterly in his power. Meanwhile, the search operation was gaining momentum. It was established that Russo had left the city immediately after the Carabiniers discovered the body. Highway cameras recorded his old Fiat Punto traveling south toward the Campania region. He withdrew all the money from his bank account, just over 3,000 euros in cash, and stopped using his cards. His cell phone was turned off. The painstaking work of checking all possible places where he could be hiding began. Abandoned houses of distant relatives in rural areas, cheap hotels on the coast, and contacts from his past. Investigators questioned his few acquaintances and customers at the workshop, trying to build a psychological profile and predict his next move. The story quickly made its way into the national media. Newspaper headlines were filled with words like monster and killer roommate, and reporters were stationed around the clock at the crime scene and at Sophia's parents' house. The public response was tremendous. A photo of a smiling Sophia contrasted on TV screens with the grim face of Gianmarco from his passport. All of Italy followed the search for the man who had not only taken the life of a young woman, but also desecrated her memory by turning the room where she died into a backdrop for his gruesome parody of a life together. The police received hundreds of calls from citizens who claimed to have seen him in different parts of the country, but every tip turned out to be false. Gianmarco Russo seemed to have vanished into thin air. After nearly 2 weeks of intensive but fruitless searching, the investigation reached a dead end. Gianmarco Russo had disappeared without leaving any financial or digital traces. Hundreds of citizen reports were checked and found to be false. Pressure from the media and the public was mounting, and Prosecutor Bellini had no new leads. The investigators returned once again to the starting point: Russo's identity. They began again, more thoroughly, to examine all of his social connections, no matter how distant or insignificant they seemed. They dug up his parents' old address books, contact lists from long-forgotten phones, and even analyzed his school yearbooks. The task was to find someone from his past whom he might remember in a desperate situation, someone who was not part of his obvious circle of acquaintances, and therefore not under police scrutiny. This painstaking work, which lasted several days, paid off. In old documents relating to his grandfather's estate, investigators found mention of Gianmarco's cousin, an older man named Antonio, who had moved to a tiny village lost in the mountains of the Basilicata region more than 20 years earlier. He led a reclusive life, had little contact with his family, and had no modern means of communication except an old landline telephone. Gianmarco had not been in touch with him for years, but this made him the ideal candidate for hiding. Antonio's house was placed under covert surveillance, and his telephone line was tapped. Nothing happened for several days. Investigators were beginning to doubt their theory, when on the 10th day of the search, June 2nd, Republic Day, the system recorded a short call. The call was not made to a landline, but to a new, recently activated mobile phone that Antonio had purchased the day before, a fact that did not escape the observers. The call was made from a prepaid SIM card purchased with cash, but its source was immediately traced. The signal came from a dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of the same village, which had been considered abandoned for many years. The arrest operation was planned and carried out within a few hours. Special forces from the Carabinieri's Cacciatori unit, which specializes in capturing fugitives in hard-to-reach rural and mountainous areas, were deployed to the scene. Late at night, under the cover of darkness, several groups of special forces silently surrounded the old stone house. No light or sound was coming from inside. At 4:30 in the morning, at dawn, when people are most vulnerable, the group commander gave the order. Instead of storming the house, it was decided to use psychological pressure. A powerful spotlight hit the windows of the house, and a loudspeaker blared out a voice amplified dozens of times across the sleepy valley. "Gianmarco Russo, the house is surrounded. Come out with your hands up. Resistance is useless." There was no response for several long, tense seconds. Then the heavy wooden door creaked open, and a silhouette appeared in the doorway. It was him. In 2 weeks on the run, Gianmarco Russo had become a shadow of his former self. He had lost a lot of weight. His gaunt face was covered with thick stubble, and his clothes hung loosely on him. There was no anger or fear in his eyes, only boundless, all-consuming fatigue. He slowly raised his hands and took a few steps forward, then dropped to his knees. He surrendered without the slightest resistance. The arrest was quick and professional. He was handcuffed and put into an armored car. His elderly uncle was also arrested on charges of harboring a criminal. During a preliminary search of the house, the remains of cash and a cheap mobile phone were found, from which he had made his only and fateful call. The return trip to Naples was spent in complete silence. Gianmarco did not utter a word. He just stared out the window at the passing landscapes, his gaze completely empty. By lunchtime the next day, the convoy arrived at the Carabinieri headquarters in Naples, where a crowd of journalists and television cameras were already waiting. He did not look in their direction as he was led inside the building, surrounded by officers. The search that had captivated the entire country was over. Gianmarco Russo was taken to an interrogation room, where prosecutor Marco Bellini was already waiting for him at the table. On the table lay only a single folder containing the case files and a photograph of a smiling Sophia Montalto. The final act of this tragedy was about to begin. Gianmarco Russo's interrogation was neither long nor dramatic. In the sterile environment of the interrogation room, accompanied by the monotonous hum of the ventilation system, he sat silently for several hours, staring at his handcuffed hands. Prosecutor Bellini did not raise his voice or resort to pressure. He methodically laid out irrefutable evidence on the table, point by point: the forensic report, a detailed chronology of events, printouts of messages, and statements from Sophia's friends and parents. He spoke about the 9 days spent in the apartment, including food orders and the TV being left on. He did not ask questions. He stated facts. When the prosecutor finished, there was a long silence in the room. Then Gianmarco slowly raised his head. His gaze was not directed at the investigators, but at Sophia's photo lying on the edge of the table. In a quiet, emotionless voice, he uttered the phrase that became the quintessence of his crime and was recorded in all the reports. "I didn't want her to be with anyone else, and while she's here, she's mine." After that, he began to give his testimony. Calmly, with a frightening detachment, he recounted the evening of May 15th, confirming the investigators' version of events. He spoke about their last conversation, about her determination to leave, and how, in his mind, that determination turned into betrayal, which he could not allow to happen. He described in detail how he took her life, how he carried her to the bedroom, how he created the illusion of sleep, and how he spent the next 9 days talking to her, watching television, and feeling, in his words, peace, because she was there, and couldn't go anywhere else. There was no remorse or regret in his words, only a statement of fact, an exposition of his twisted, monstrous logic. The trial, which began a few months later, was short. The prosecution presented a comprehensive body of evidence, backed up by Rousseau's full confession. His lawyers attempted to build a defense based on emotional state, arguing that the murder was committed in the heat of passion rather than cold calculation, which would have mitigated the sentence. However, the court found these arguments unconvincing. On March 21, 2023, the Naples Assize Court, Court d'Assises di Napoli, found Gianmarco Russo guilty of premeditated murder with aggravating circumstances. The aggravating factors cited were the brutality of the crime, the established relationship with the victim, and the subsequent concealment of the body and attempts to mislead the investigation. The court rejected all requests for leniency and sentenced Gianmarco Russo to life imprisonment, ergastolo, the highest penalty in the Italian Republic. The public reaction was predictable. The case of Sophia Montalto became one of many in Italy's grim statistics on femicide. Still, its details, the 9 days the killer spent with the victim's body, made it stand out from the rest. Rallies were held across the country in memory of Sophia, and human rights organizations once again raised the issue of the need for more effective measures to protect women from domestic violence. The story dominated talk shows and newspaper headlines for several weeks, then, as always, gradually faded from the news agenda, giving way to new tragedies. The fourth-floor apartment in the Fuori Grotta district stood sealed for a long time before being sold to new owners who knew nothing of its history. And in the pharmacy in the Chiaia district, behind the same counter where Sophia Montalto once worked, there is now another pharmacist who serves customers just as politely, dispensing medicines for pain, coughs, and insomnia.